Sarah Martinez had always been different. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a slight frame, she looked nothing like what people expected from a Marine. Her dark hair was always pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. But there was something about her that made the other Marines uneasy. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, or perhaps it was the mysterious tattoo that peeked out from under her collar. The tattoo was small, barely visible unless you looked closely. Most of the time, Sarah kept it hidden under her uniform, but during training exercises when the heat became unbearable, sometimes her collar would shift, revealing just a hint of black ink on her neck. The other Marines had noticed it months ago, and it had become a source of constant mockery. "Hey, Martinez," called out Corporal Jake Stevens during morning formation. "What's that scribble on your neck? Did you let your little sister draw on you with a marker?" The group of Marines around him laughed, their voices echoing across the training ground. Sarah stood at attention, her eyes focused straight ahead, not acknowledging the comment. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Private Danny Walsh joined in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I bet it's some girly butterfly or a heart with her boyfriend's name. Probably got it done at some strip mall parlor back home." More laughter erupted from the group. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure. She had endured worse than this throughout her military career. Being a woman in the Marines was challenging enough without drawing additional attention to herself. Sergeant Rodriguez, their drill instructor, approached the formation. "What's all the chatter about, Marines?" "Just discussing Martinez's artwork, Sergeant," Stevens replied with a smirk. "Wondering if it meets Marine Corps standards." Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Sarah, then back at the group. "Unless that tattoo violates regulations, it's none of your business. Now drop, and give me 20 for talking during formation." The Marines groaned and dropped to the ground for push-ups. Sarah remained standing, grateful for Rodriguez's intervention, though she knew it was only temporary. The harassment would continue as soon as he was out of earshot. After formation, Sarah walked alone toward the mess hall. The California sun beat down on the base, and she could feel the sweat beginning to form under her heavy uniform. Camp Pendleton was always hot this time of year, but today felt especially brutal. "Martinez, wait up," called a voice behind her. She turned to see Private Maria Gonzalez jogging to catch up. Maria was one of the few other women in their unit and had always been friendly, though they weren't particularly close. "Don't let them get to you," Maria said as she fell in a step beside Sarah. "They're just idiots looking for something to pick on." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "It doesn't bother me." Maria studied her face. "What is it anyway?" "The tattoo, I mean. I've never gotten a good look at it." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "Just something personal. Come on, it can't be that bad." Stevens and Walsh make it sound like you've got a whole mural back there. "It's nothing important," Sarah insisted, quickening her pace. Maria sensed she had pushed too far and dropped the subject. They walked the rest of the way to the mess hall in comfortable silence. Inside the mess hall, the air was thick with the smell of cafeteria food and the sound of dozens of conversations. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the line, selecting a sandwich and some fruit. She found an empty table in the corner and sat down, preferring the solitude. As she ate, she could hear fragments of conversation from nearby tables. Most of it was the usual military chatter, complaints about training, discussions of weekend plans, speculation about upcoming deployments. But occasionally, she caught snippets about herself. Weird about her, probably hiding something, doesn't fit in. Sarah had heard all before. She had been an outsider for most of her life, long before joining the Marines. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, she had learned to keep to herself and stay out of trouble. Her parents worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and Sarah spent most of her childhood taking care of her younger siblings. Joining the Marines had been her way out, a chance for a better life, and the opportunity to serve her country. She had excelled in boot camp, surprising everyone with her physical and mental toughness. But success in training didn't automatically translate to acceptance among her peers. The afternoon training exercise was particularly grueling. The temperature had climbed over 100 degrees, and they were running tactical drills in full combat gear. Sarah pushed herself hard, keeping up with the larger, stronger Marines despite her smaller stature. During a brief water break, Stevens approached her, sweat dripping down his face. "You know, Martinez, I'll give you credit. You can keep up better than I expected for someone who looks like she belongs in a library instead of a war zone." It was probably meant as a compliment, but it stung nonetheless. Sarah took a long drink from her canteen and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thanks," she said simply. "So seriously, what is that thing on your neck? Is it some kind of gang tattoo? Were you in a gang before you joined up?" Sarah's blood ran cold. The assumption that because she was Latina and from Los Angeles, she must have gang connections was both offensive and sadly common. She had worked hard to distance herself from those stereotypes. "No," she said firmly. "I was never in a gang." "Then what is it? Come on, we're all Marines here. We're supposed to trust each other with our lives. Don't you think we have a right to know what kind of person we're serving with?" Other Marines had gathered around, sensing drama. Sarah felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes on her, judging her, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. "It's personal," she repeated, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Walsh pushed forward through the group. "Personal? We don't get to have personal in the Marines. We're a unit. Your secrets could get us killed." "It's just a tattoo," Sarah said. "It has nothing to do with my service or my loyalty to the Corps." "Then prove it," Stevens challenged. "Show us what you're hiding." The circle of Marines tightened around her. Sarah could feel her heart racing, not from fear but from frustration and anger. She had spent years proving herself, over and over again, only to be questioned at every turn. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Yeah, you do," Walsh shot back. "We're going into combat together. We need to know we can trust you completely." The implication was clear. They thought her tattoo represented some kind of divided loyalty or criminal past. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing suspicion and hostility where there should have been camaraderie and brotherhood. "All right, Marines, break it up." Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Water breaks over. Back to training." The group reluctantly dispersed, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her as they returned to their positions. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and she knew it would only grow. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of physical exertion and mental strain. Sarah performed every drill perfectly, hit every target, completed every task without complaint. But she could sense the distance growing between herself and the other Marines. They were pulling away from her, creating an isolation that felt almost physical. As evening approached and they returned to the barracks, Sarah overheard Stevens talking to a group of Marines near the showers. "I'm telling you, there's something off about her," he was saying. "Why else would she be so secretive? Normal people don't act like that." "Maybe she's got cartel connections," suggested another Marine. "You know how those gangs mark their members." "Or maybe she's just ashamed of something stupid she did as a kid," offered a more reasonable voice. "Either way, I don't like mysteries in my unit," Stevens concluded. "We need to know who we're dealing with." Sarah sat on her bunk, pretending to read while she listened. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with various theories being proposed and debated. None of them were correct, but all of them painted her as someone untrustworthy or dangerous. Later that night, as the barracks settled into quiet, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded her as she replayed the day's events in her mind. She had faced discrimination and suspicion before, but this felt different. These were supposed to be her brothers and sisters in arms, people who would fight alongside her and depend on her in life or death situations. The tattoo on her neck seemed to burn in the darkness, as if it were glowing with the weight of the secret it represented. She touched it gently through her t-shirt, feeling the raised lines of ink under her fingertips. It wasn't a gang symbol or a mark of shame. It was something far more significant, something that represented sacrifice and honor in ways these Marines couldn't begin to understand. But she couldn't tell them that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning brought another day of training and another round of questions and suspicions. Sarah went through the motions, performing her duties with the same dedication and skill she always demonstrated. But the isolation was becoming harder to bear. During a particularly challenging obstacle course exercise, Sarah found herself paired with Walsh for a buddy team drill. They had to navigate through a series of barriers and challenges while covering for each other, simulating combat conditions. As they low-crawled under razor wire, Walsh spoke quietly beside her. "You know, Martinez, this would be a lot easier if we actually trusted each other." Sarah kept crawling, focusing on the task at hand. "Trust is earned through actions, not confessions." "But," Secrets create doubt, Walsh replied. And doubt can get people killed. They reached the end of the wire and sprinted toward the next obstacle, a high wall that required teamwork to overcome. Sarah boosted Walsh up first, then he reached down to pull her up. Look, he said as they prepared for the next section. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but when someone in your unit is hiding something, it makes everyone nervous. We just want to know we can count on you. You can count on me, Sarah said simply. I've never given you reason to think otherwise. They continued through the course, working together effectively despite the underlying tension. Sarah had to admit that Walsh was a good Marine, dedicated and skilled. His suspicion wasn't coming from a bad place. It was coming from a desire to protect his fellow soldiers. But that didn't make it any less frustrating. As they approached the finish line, Walsh tried once more. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than the things we're all imagining. Why don't you just tell us and put an end to all this speculation? Sarah stopped running and turned to face him. For a moment, she considered it. She imagined pulling down her collar and showing him the tattoo, explaining what it meant and why it was so important to her. She pictured the look of understanding on his face, followed by shame for having doubted her. But then she remembered all the other times she had trusted people with her secrets, only to have them used against her. She remembered the judgment and the assumptions, the way people's perceptions of her changed when they learned certain facts about her life. Some things are private, she said finally. Even in the Marines. They finished the course in silence, both of them frustrated and no closer to understanding each other than they had been at the start. The pattern continued for weeks. Training exercises, meals, downtime. Every interaction was colored by the mystery of Sarah's tattoo and her refusal to explain it. The other Marines' curiosity had evolved into suspicion, and their suspicion was hardening into hostility. Sarah found herself eating alone more often, working out by herself, spending her free time reading or writing letters home while the others socialized. The isolation was painful, but she told herself it was temporary. Eventually, they would move on to other topics, other sources of entertainment. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Military units were built on trust and shared experiences. By keeping this secret, she was violating an unspoken code that bound Marines together. She understood their frustration, even as she resented their intrusion into her privacy. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning her rifle in preparation for the next day's exercises, Private Gonzalez approached her again. "Can I sit?" Maria asked, gesturing to the bench beside Sarah. Sarah nodded, grateful for any friendly interaction. "This is getting out of hand," Maria said without preamble. "The guys are starting to talk about bringing it up with the CEO. They think you might be some kind of security risk." Sarah's hands stilled on her weapon. "A security risk? That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Maria asked gently. "Sarah, I want to believe you're just a private person. But you have to understand how this looks. You won't talk about your background, you keep to yourself, and now there's this mysterious tattoo that you won't explain. In their minds, you're acting like someone with something to hide. Everyone has things they'd rather not share," Sarah replied. "That doesn't make them dangerous." "Maybe not," Maria agreed. "But it makes them suspicious. And suspicion breeds doubt, and doubt can destroy a unit's cohesion." Sarah set down her rifle and looked at Maria directly. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you consider trusting us," Maria said. "Whatever that tattoo represents, whatever you're afraid of, we're Marines. We're your family now. We stick together, no matter what." The words were kindly meant, but they stung. Sarah had heard similar promises before from people who claimed to care about her. Most of those promises had been broken when the truth became inconvenient or uncomfortable. "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "But some things are too personal to share." Maria sighed. "Then, you need to be prepared for the consequences. Because this isn't going to just blow over. It's going to keep getting worse until something forces it to a head." As if to prove Maria's point, Stevens and a group of Marines approached from across the courtyard. Their expressions were serious, and Sarah could see determination in their movements. "Martinez," Stevens called out as they drew near. "We need to talk." Sarah stood up, instinctively shifting into a defensive posture. "About what?" "About this whole secrecy thing," Stevens replied. "It's affecting unit morale and cohesion. We've decided to give you one more chance to come clean voluntarily." "And if I don't?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Then we take it up the chain of command," Walsh said, stepping forward. Let the officers decide whether you're fit for service." The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her heart racing as she considered her options. She could continue to refuse, which would likely lead to an investigation and possible disciplinary action. Or she could reveal her secret and face whatever consequences came with that truth. Neither option was appealing. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You've had weeks to think," Stevens replied. "This ends tomorrow. Either you tell us what that tattoo means, or we file a report with the CEO. Your choice." The group walked away, leaving Sarah alone with Maria and the weight of an impossible decision. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Sarah of home. She touched her neck where the tattoo lay hidden beneath her collar, feeling the familiar outline of the design that had been with her for so many years. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between her privacy and her career, between protecting her secret and protecting her future. Either way, her life in the Marines was about to change forever. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of her fellow Marines breathing in the darkness around her. Some snored softly, others mumbled in their sleep, but all of them seemed to rest peacefully while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. The ultimatum Stevens had given her echoed in her thoughts. Reveal the secret or face investigation. Neither choice seemed acceptable, but morning was approaching rapidly, and she would have to decide soon. She had spent so many years protecting this secret, carefully constructing her life to ensure it remained hidden. The tattoo wasn't just ink on her skin. It was a symbol of something much deeper, something that could change how everyone saw her if they knew the truth. As the first hints of dawn began to filter through the barracks windows, Sarah made her decision. She would continue to refuse to explain the tattoo, regardless of the consequences. Some things were more important than her military career, and this was one of them. But as she prepared for morning formation, doubt crept in. Was she being stubborn and prideful? Was she putting her own privacy above the needs of her unit? These questions had no easy answers. Morning formation proceeded normally until Sergeant Rodriguez dismissed them for breakfast. As the group began to disperse, Stevens stepped forward. "Martinez," he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Have you made your decision?" The other Marines stopped and turned, forming an impromptu circle around them. Sarah felt dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. The moment felt suspended in time, heavy with anticipation. "Yes," she said quietly. "I have." "And?" Stevens prompted. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "My answer hasn't changed. My personal life is private, and I won't be forced to discuss it." A murmur went through the gathered Marines. Some seemed disappointed, others appeared angry, and a few looked almost relieved that the standoff would finally be resolved one way or another. "Fine," Stevens said. "You've made your choice. Walsh, Gonzalez, you're with me. We're going to see Captain Morrison." As Stevens and his group walked away toward the command building, the remaining Marines began to disperse. Sarah noticed that many of them avoided making eye contact with her, as if she had already been judged and found wanting. Maria lingered for a moment, her expression conflicted. "Sarah, are you sure about this? Once they file that report, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed none of the uncertainty she felt inside. "Whatever that tattoo means to you, it must be pretty important," Maria observed. Sarah nodded, but said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The next few hours passed in an agonizing blur of routine activities. Sarah attended training sessions, performed her duties, and went through the motions of normal military life while knowing that somewhere in the command building, her fate was being decided by people who didn't know her or understand her situation. Around midday, a runner appeared at the training ground looking for Sarah. "Martinez, Captain Morrison wants to see you in his office." Now, the walk to the command building felt longer than usual. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation she had hoped to avoid. Other Marines watched her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to barely concealed satisfaction. Captain Morrison's office was spartanly decorated with the usual military efficiency. An American flag stood in one corner, and his desk was covered with neat stacks of paperwork. The captain himself was a veteran Marine in his 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Sit down, Martinez," he said without looking up from a file on his desk. Sarah took the offered chair and waited, her hands folded in her lap. "I've received some interesting reports about you," Captain Morrison continued, finally, raising his eyes to meet hers. "Your fellow Marines seem to think you're hiding something that could affect unit readiness and cohesion." "With respect, sir, I disagree," Sarah replied. "My personal life has never interfered with my duties or my service." "Personal life?" The captain leaned back in his chair. "From what I understand, we're talking about a tattoo. That's hardly private territory in the military." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. "The thing is, Martinez, I've reviewed your file thoroughly. Your performance has been exemplary since day one. Your test scores, physical fitness evaluations, and peer reviews have all been outstanding. Until this issue arose, I would have considered you a model Marine. I hope I still am, sir." Captain Morrison studied her for a long moment. "That depends on what you're willing to tell me about this tattoo that has everyone so concerned." The question hung in the air between them. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came when someone pushed too hard for information she wasn't ready to share. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't believe my tattoo has any bearing on my ability to serve effectively." "Maybe not," the captain agreed. "But the suspicion and speculation it's generating certainly does. A divided unit is a weak unit, Martinez. And weak units get people killed." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Sarah understood the gravity of the situation, but she also understood the gravity of what she was being asked to reveal. "I can order you to show me this tattoo," Captain Morrison said quietly. "Is that what it's going to take?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. An order was an order, and disobeying it would mean court-martial and discharge. Her military career would be over, and, with it, all her plans for the future. "If you order me to show it, I will comply," she said finally. "But, sir, I'm asking you to trust that it represents nothing that would compromise my service or my loyalty to the Corps." The captain was quiet for several long minutes, his eyes never leaving her face. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward in his chair. "Here's what's going to happen, Martinez. I'm going to give you 1 week to resolve this situation. Either you convince your fellow Marines that their suspicions are unfounded, or you provide me with an explanation that puts this matter to rest. After that week, if this issue is still affecting unit cohesion, I will make the decision for you." "Understood." "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Sarah stood up and saluted, then turned and walked out of the office. The reprieve was temporary, but it was still a reprieve. 7 days to figure out how to handle a situation that had been building for months. As she walked back toward the training grounds, Sarah found herself thinking about the events that had led to this moment. The tattoo on her neck was small and simple, just black ink in a design that most people wouldn't recognize. But it represented something so significant that she had been willing to risk her entire military career to protect its meaning. The afternoon training session was particularly uncomfortable. Word had spread quickly that Sarah had met with the captain, and every Marine in the unit seemed to have an opinion about what that meant. "I heard Morrison gave her an ultimatum," someone whispered during weapons maintenance. "About time," another voice replied. "This whole mystery thing has gone on long enough." "What if she really is hiding something dangerous?" asked a third Marine. "What if we're serving with someone who shouldn't be here?" Sarah tried to focus on her work, methodically cleaning and inspecting her rifle while the speculation swirled around her. She had become an object of curiosity and suspicion rather than a fellow Marine, and that isolation was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. During the dinner break, she found herself sitting alone again, picking at her food while conversations buzzed at nearby tables. The mess hall felt larger and emptier than usual, as if the space between her and the other Marines had physically expanded. "Mind if I join you?" a voice asked. Sarah looked up to see Private First Class Tommy Chun standing with his tray, looking genuinely friendly rather than suspicious or hostile. "Sure," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Chun sat down and began eating his dinner without immediately launching into questions about her tattoo or her meeting with the captain. The silence was comfortable rather than tense, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly for the first time all day. "You know," Chun said eventually, "I've got a tattoo that I keep covered too." Sarah looked at him with interest. "Really?" "Yeah, got it before I joined up, and it's not exactly military appropriate. My grandmother's name in Chinese characters, but the artist made a mistake." Instead of beloved grandmother, it actually says old fish. My family thinks it's hilarious, but I'm not eager to share that particular embarrassment with everyone here. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. That's actually pretty funny. Exactly. The point is, everyone has their reasons for keeping things private. Maybe yours are more serious than mine, but that doesn't make you a bad Marine or a security risk. Chen's words were the first genuinely supportive ones Sarah had heard in weeks. She felt a surge of gratitude toward this Marine who was willing to look beyond the mystery and see her as a person rather than a problem to be solved. Thanks, she said simply. That means a lot. For what it's worth, I think this whole thing has gotten way out of hand, Chen continued. You've never given anyone reason to doubt your commitment or your competence. This obsession with your tattoo says more about them than it does about you. They finished their dinner in comfortable conversation, talking about their backgrounds, their families, and their hopes for their military careers. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she was talking to a friend rather than defending herself against an interrogator. But as they prepared to return to evening training, Chen offered a gentle warning. That said, you should know that the pressure isn't going away. If anything, it's getting worse. Some of the guys are talking about making this a bigger issue if you don't resolve it soon. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean, they're talking about going above Captain Morrison if they don't get answers. Stevens thinks this could be a security issue that needs investigation by military intelligence. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Military intelligence meant background checks, interviews, investigations into every aspect of her life. There would be no way to keep her secret if that happened. How much time do I have? She asked. Chen shrugged. Hard to say. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. But, Martinez, whatever you're hiding, you need to decide if it's worth potentially destroying your career over. That evening, Sarah lay in her bunk, once again staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. The situation was escalating beyond her control, and soon she would have to make a choice that would change everything. She thought about her family back home in Los Angeles, about the sacrifices they had made to help her get where she was today. She thought about her dreams of making the military a career, of serving her country with honor and distinction. All of that was now in jeopardy because of a small tattoo and her stubborn refusal to explain its significance. But she also thought about the reason she had gotten the tattoo in the first place, about what it represented, and why it was so important to keep that information private. Some things were worth fighting for, even if that fight came at a tremendous personal cost. The next morning brought more of the same tension and speculation. Sarah went through her routine mechanically, performing her duties while her mind worked frantically to find a solution that would satisfy everyone involved. During a break in training, she overheard Stevens talking to a group of Marines near the equipment shed. I'm telling you, this has gone on long enough, he was saying. Morrison gave her a week, but that's 6 days too many. We need to know who we're dealing with before we deploy. Deploy? Asked one of the other Marines. Haven't you heard? Word is we're getting deployment orders soon. Somewhere in the Middle East. You really want to go into combat with someone who might have divided loyalties. The conversation continued, but Sarah had heard enough. The stakes had just gotten significantly higher. It was one thing to deal with suspicion and gossip during training exercises, but the thought of carrying this burden into actual combat situations was unthinkable. She needed to find a way to resolve this crisis without compromising the secret she had worked so hard to protect. But as the days passed and the pressure continued to mount, Sarah began to wonder if such a solution even existed. The weight of the decision was crushing, but time was running out. Soon, she would have to choose between revealing the truth about her tattoo and losing everything she had worked for. Neither option seemed acceptable, but she was rapidly running out of alternatives. As she looked around at the Marines who had once been her peers and were now her accusers, Sarah realized that the next few days would determine not just her future in the military, but the kind of person she would be for the rest of her life. The choice she made would define her, one way or another, forever. The tattoo on her neck seemed to pulse with significance as she contemplated the impossible decision ahead of her. Whatever she chose to do, there would be no going back. The moment of truth was approaching, and Sarah Martinez would have to decide what she was really willing to sacrifice to protect the secret that had become both her burden and her strength. The third day of Sarah's week-long ultimatum dawned gray and overcast, matching her increasingly troubled mood. She had spent the previous 2 days trying to find a way out of her impossible situation, But every option seemed to lead to the same painful conclusion. She would have to choose between her secret and her career. As morning formation began, Sarah noticed that the other Marines were watching her more intently than usual. Word had spread about Captain Morrison's deadline, and everyone seemed to be waiting for her to crack under the mounting pressure. Sergeant Rodriguez called them to attention and began the day's briefing. Listen up, Marines. We've received preliminary deployment orders. Nothing confirmed yet, but it looks like we'll be heading to Afghanistan within the next few months. A murmur of excitement and apprehension rippled through the formation. For most of these Marines, this would be their first combat deployment, the culmination of months of training and preparation. That means the next few weeks are crucial, Rodriguez continued. We need to function as a cohesive unit, trusting each other completely. Any personal issues or conflicts need to be resolved immediately. Lives depend on it. His eyes found Sarah in the formation, and the message was clear. This wasn't just about unit morale anymore. It was about survival in combat. After formation, Stevens approached Sarah with several other Marines in tow. His expression was more serious than antagonistic, which somehow made the confrontation feel more ominous. Martinez, we need to talk, he said quietly. About the deployment. Sarah nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Look, I'll be honest with you, Stevens continued. Whatever personal beef we might have had before doesn't matter now. We're going into combat together, and that changes everything. I agree, Sarah replied. We need to work as a team. Then you understand why this secrecy thing can't continue, Walsh added. In Afghanistan, hesitation or mistrust can get people killed. We need to know that everyone in this unit is completely committed to the mission and to each other. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. My commitment has never been in question. My performance speaks for itself. Your performance is excellent, Stevens admitted. But performance in training isn't the same as performance in combat. In combat, trust is everything. And right now, we don't trust you because we don't know who you really are. The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Sarah had kept herself apart from the group, maintained her privacy so carefully that she had created exactly the kind of suspicion and doubt that could be dangerous in combat. What are you asking me to do? She said finally. Show us the tattoo, Walsh said simply. Explain what it means. Give us a reason to trust you completely. Other Marines had gathered around, drawn by the serious tone of the conversation. Sarah realized that this had become more than just curiosity or harassment. It had become a test of her fitness for combat duty. I need more time, she said. Time is exactly what we don't have, Stevens replied. The captain gave you a week, but we leave for advanced combat training in 5 days. This needs to be resolved before then. The group dispersed, leaving Sarah standing alone in the courtyard, feeling more isolated than ever. The deployment had changed everything. What had been a matter of personal privacy was now a question of combat readiness and unit cohesion. She spent the rest of the morning struggling to concentrate on training exercises. Her mind kept wandering to the impossible choice she faced: reveal her secret and face the consequences, or maintain her privacy and potentially lose her career and her chance to serve with her unit. During lunch, Maria approached her table and sat down without invitation. You look terrible, Maria said bluntly. When's the last time you actually slept? I'm fine, Sarah replied automatically. No, you're not. And at this rate, you're going to make yourself sick before you even have to make a decision. Sarah pushed her food around on her plate, her appetite having disappeared days ago. I don't know what to do, Maria. Every option I have seems wrong. Maybe that's because you're thinking about this the wrong way, Maria suggested. Instead of focusing on what you might lose, think about what you might gain. What do you mean? I mean, maybe your secret isn't as dangerous as you think it is. Maybe telling the truth would actually make things better instead of worse. Sarah shook her head. You don't understand. This isn't just about me. Other people would be affected if this information came out. Other people? Like who? Sarah hesitated, realizing she had said more than she intended. It's complicated. Everything's complicated, Maria replied. But complications can be worked through if people are willing to trust each other. That afternoon, Sarah received a message to report to Captain Morrison's office. Her heart sank as she walked across the base, wondering if her time had already run out. The captain was reviewing paperwork when she entered, but he looked up immediately and gestured for her to sit. How are you holding up, Martinez? He asked, and for the first time, His tone seemed genuinely concerned rather than official. I'm managing, sir. Are you? Because from what I'm hearing, this situation is affecting more than just you now. Your whole unit is on edge. Sarah nodded, unable to deny the obvious. I'm going to be frank with you. Captain Morrison continued. I've been a Marine for 22 years. I've served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places where Marines had to depend on each other to stay alive. I know what trust looks like, and I know what happens when that trust breaks down. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious, but not unkind. Right now, your unit doesn't trust you. That's not entirely your fault. Some of this is just typical military bullying and harassment. But part of it is because you've chosen to keep yourself separate from the group. Sir, I've never... Let me finish, he interrupted gently. You've performed your duties excellently, but you haven't integrated socially with your peers. That might not matter in garrison, but it matters tremendously in combat. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. So I'm being penalized for being introverted? You're not being penalized for anything, Captain Morrison replied. But you are being asked to consider whether your privacy is worth more than the lives of your fellow Marines. The words hit like a physical blow. Sir, that's not fair, isn't it? If your unit deploys with this level of mistrust and suspicion, people could die because of hesitation or poor communication. Is whatever you're hiding worth that risk? Sarah sat in silence, grappling with the impossible weight of the captain's words. She had never thought about her secrecy in those terms, but she couldn't deny the logic of his argument. I'm not ordering you to reveal your secret, Captain Morrison said quietly, but I'm asking you to seriously consider the consequences of continuing to keep it. You have 3 more days before I have to make a decision about your deployment status. My deployment status, sir? If I determine that your presence would compromise unit cohesion, I'll have to transfer you to a different unit, one that's not deploying. The threat was devastating. Sarah had trained for months with this unit, had looked forward to serving with them in Afghanistan. The thought of being left behind while they deployed was almost unbearable. Understand, sir, she said finally. Good. Now go get some rest. You look exhausted. That evening, Sarah walked to the base chapel, seeking solitude and perhaps some guidance in making her decision. The small building was empty and peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension and conflict that had consumed her life for the past week. She sat in a back pew and tried to pray, but her mind kept returning to the same impossible questions. How could she reveal something so personal, so potentially damaging? But how could she not, when the lives and safety of her fellow Marines might depend on their trust in her? The tattoo on her neck seemed to burn with significance as she contemplated her options. It represented something so important to her that she had been willing to risk everything to protect it. But maybe the time for protection had passed. Maybe it was time for truth, regardless of the consequences. As she sat in the quiet chapel, memories flooded back to her. She remembered the day she had gotten the tattoo, remembered why it had been so important, and what it had meant to her then. Those reasons hadn't changed, but her circumstances certainly had. She thought about her fellow Marines, about Stevens and Walsh, and even Maria, who tried so hard to understand and help. They weren't bad people. They were scared and confused, facing deployment to a dangerous place with someone they felt they couldn't trust completely. Sarah also thought about her family, about the sacrifices they had made, and the pride they had felt when she graduated from boot camp. Would they understand if she chose to reveal her secret? Would they forgive her if she chose to protect it at the cost of her military career? The questions had no easy answers, but sitting in the peaceful chapel, Sarah began to feel a sense of clarity that had eluded her for days. She wasn't going to find a perfect solution to this problem, but she could find a right one. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of resolution that surprised her. For the first time in days, she had slept soundly, and she felt more alert and focused than she had since this crisis began. She went through her morning routine with unusual care, making sure her uniform was perfect and her equipment was properly maintained. Whatever happened today, she wanted to face it as a Marine. During morning formation, Sergeant Rodriguez announced that they would be conducting advanced tactical exercises in preparation for deployment. The training would be intense and realistic, designed to test their readiness for combat operations. As they prepared for the exercises, Stevens approached Sarah one more time. Martinez, I want you to know that whatever happens with this tattoo situation, I respect your service, he said. You're a good Marine, and I hope we can work this out. The unexpected gesture of respect caught Sarah off guard. Thank you. That means a lot. But this still needs to be resolved before we deploy, he continued. Too much is at stake to leave it unfinished. Sarah nodded. I know, and it will be resolved. Soon. The tactical exercises were exhausting and challenging, requiring the Marines to work together in small teams under simulated combat conditions. Sarah found herself paired with different Marines throughout the day, and she could feel them evaluating her performance, watching for signs of hesitation or divided loyalty. She performed flawlessly, as she always did, but she could sense that her technical competence wasn't enough to overcome the atmosphere of suspicion that surrounded her. During a break between exercises, she overheard a conversation between two Marines she didn't know well. I don't care how good she is, one was saying. If she can't trust us enough to be honest about something as simple as a tattoo, how can we trust her when bullets start flying? Maybe the tattoo isn't simple, the other replied. Maybe it's something really serious. That's exactly my point. We need to know what we're dealing with. Sarah walked away before she could hear more, but the conversation confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't going away on its own, and continuing to refuse to explain would only make things worse. That evening, she made her decision. She found Maria in the barracks and asked to speak with her privately. They walked outside to a quiet area near the base perimeter, where they could talk without being overheard. I've decided to tell them about the tattoo, Sarah said without preamble. Maria's eyes widened with surprise and relief. Really? Sarah, I think that's the right choice. I hope so, Sarah replied. But I need to ask you for a favor first. Anything. When I tell them what the tattoo means, it's going to be difficult for me. I might need a friend there for support. Of course, Maria said immediately. Whatever you need. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she were about to jump off a cliff. Tomorrow morning, after formation, I'm going to show them the tattoo and explain what it means. Will you be there? I'll be there, Maria promised. And Sarah? Whatever this secret is, it's not going to change who you are or how we see you as a Marine. Sarah wished she could be as confident about that as Maria seemed to be. But the decision was made, and tomorrow she would finally reveal the truth that she had protected for so long. As she lay in her bunk that night, Sarah touched the tattoo gently through her t-shirt. Tomorrow, everyone would know what it meant and why it was so important to her. She could only hope that the truth would be enough to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by weeks of secrecy and suspicion. The weight of the decision settled over her like a blanket, but for the first time in days, it felt like a comfortable weight rather than a crushing burden. She had chosen truth over secrecy, trust over privacy. Whatever consequences followed from that choice, she would face them as a Marine. Sarah woke before dawn, her heart already racing with anticipation and anxiety about what the day would bring. She had barely slept, despite her resolution the night before. Every time she had closed her eyes, her mind replayed scenarios of how the revelation might unfold, each one ending differently, but none of them particularly comforting. She dressed with extra care, making sure every detail of her uniform was perfect. If she was going to expose her most guarded secret, she wanted to do it with dignity and pride. The tattoo on her neck felt warm against her skin, as if it were responding to the knowledge that its hidden meaning would soon be revealed to the world. Morning formation proceeded normally, with Sergeant Rodriguez running through the day's training schedule and administrative announcements. Sarah stood at attention with the rest of her unit, but she could feel the weight of curious glances from her fellow Marines. Word had somehow spread that something significant was going to happen today, though she couldn't imagine how. After formation was dismissed, Sarah remained standing in place while the other Marines began to disperse toward the mess hall for breakfast. Her mouth was dry and her hands were trembling slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Stevens, Walsh," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The two Marines stopped and turned, surprise evident on their faces. Other Marines who had been walking away also paused, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Actually," Sarah continued, looking around at the growing crowd of onlookers, "anyone who wants to hear this can stay. I think it's time to clear the air." Maria appeared at her side, offering silent support with her presence. Chen also moved closer, along with Rodriguez and about 20 other Marines from their unit. The circle that formed around Sarah felt both supportive and intimidating at the same time. You all know about my tattoo, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You've been asking questions about it for weeks, and I've refused to answer. That ends today. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her uniform shirt, then carefully pulled down the collar to expose her neck. The tattoo was now fully visible for the first time since she had arrived at Camp Pendleton. A collective intake of breath came from the gathered Marines as they saw the design clearly for the first time. It was small, but intricate, a military insignia that many of them recognized but didn't immediately understand in this context. It's a Navy cross, Stephen said quietly, his voice filled with confusion. But why would you? Sarah took a deep breath and began the story she had never told anyone in her military unit. My older brother Miguel was a Marine, she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. He served 3 tours in Iraq with the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for actions that saved the lives of his entire squad. The circle of Marines was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Miguel was killed by an IED while pulling wounded Marines to safety during an ambush in Fallujah, Sarah continued. He could have taken cover, but he chose to risk his life to save his fellow Marines. The Navy Cross was the 2nd highest military decoration for valor, and Miguel earned it by being the kind of Marine that every Marine should aspire to be. She paused, touching the tattoo gently with her fingertips. I got this tattoo on the 5-year anniversary of his death, not just to remember him, but to remind myself every day of the standard he set. Every time I put on this uniform, every time I train, every time I face a challenge, I remember Miguel and try to live up to the example he set. Walsh stepped closer. His expression transformed from suspicion to something approaching awe. Martinez, we had no idea. You couldn't have known, Sarah replied. I didn't tell you, but now you understand why this is so personal to me. It's not just a tattoo. It's my brother's legacy. It's everything he stood for, everything he died for. Stevens ran his hand through his hair, looking embarrassed and ashamed. Jesus Martinez. We thought all kinds of stupid things. I know what you thought, Sarah said without accusation. And I understand why you thought it. A young Latina from East LA with a mysterious tattoo that she won't explain. I get it. But the truth is that this tattoo represents more honor and courage than I'll ever be able to live up to. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression serious, but respectful. Martinez, why didn't you just tell us this from the beginning? This is exactly the kind of thing that Marines respect and understand. Sarah's composure wavered slightly as she struggled to find the right words. Because Miguel's death was complicated. The full story never made it into the official reports, and my family asked me to keep certain details private. What kind of details? Maria asked gently. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength for the hardest part of her revelation. Miguel wasn't supposed to be on patrol that day, she said quietly. He was scheduled for leave, supposed to come home for my high school graduation. But one of the Marines in his squad was sick, and Miguel volunteered to take his place. She opened her eyes and looked around at the faces surrounding her. The Marine who was supposed to go on that patrol was dating a girl back home who was pregnant. Miguel knew that if something happened to him, that Marine would never see his child grow up. So he took his place, knowing it was dangerous, knowing he might not come back. The emotional weight of the story was evident on every face in the circle. Several Marines had to wipe their eyes, and even the normally stoic Sergeant Rodriguez appeared to be struggling with his composure. Miguel died so that another Marine could live to meet his son, Sarah continued. That Marine came to Miguel's funeral and told my family what had happened. He was carrying so much guilt and grief that it was destroying him. My family made the decision to keep that detail private, to let Miguel's official record show that he died heroically without mentioning the personal sacrifice he made for his fellow Marine. Stevens shook his head in amazement. That's incredible. Your brother was a true Marine. He was, Sarah agreed. But here's the thing you need to understand. Miguel's sacrifice wasn't just about saving one life. It was about the principle that Marines take care of each other, that we put the welfare of our fellow Marines above our own interests. She looked directly at Stevens and Walsh as she continued. For weeks, you've been questioning my loyalty and my commitment because I wouldn't share this story. But the reason I kept it private was exactly the same reason Miguel took that patrol, to protect someone else. The Marine whose place Miguel took has struggled with survivor's guilt for years. He's built a good life, has a wonderful family, but he still carries the weight of Miguel's sacrifice. Revealing the full story publicly could destroy the peace he's worked so hard to find. The implications of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They had been demanding that she prove her loyalty by betraying the very principles that her brother had died to uphold. So you see, Sarah said, this tattoo doesn't represent divided loyalty or hidden shame. It represents the highest ideals of the Marine Corps: honor, courage, commitment, and, above all, loyalty to your fellow Marines. Walsh stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Martinez, I owe you a huge apology. We all do. We completely misjudged this situation. We made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice, Stevens added. There's no excuse for that. Other Marines began speaking up, offering their own apologies and expressions of respect. The atmosphere had changed completely from suspicion and hostility to shame and admiration. But Sarah held up her hand to quiet the voices. I appreciate the apologies and I accept them, she said. But I need you all to understand something important. I didn't tell you this story to make you feel guilty or to prove my worthiness. I told you because we're about to deploy together, and you deserve to know who I really am and what drives me. She looked around at each face in the circle. Miguel's example is the reason I became a Marine. His sacrifice is the reason I push myself so hard in training. His memory is the reason I would never hesitate to put my life on the line for any of you, regardless of how you've treated me. The emotional intensity of the moment was overwhelming. Several Marines were openly crying, and even the most hardened veterans in the group appeared deeply moved. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward and addressed the group. Marines, what we've witnessed here today is exactly what the Corps is supposed to be about, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Martinez has shown us what true honor looks like, both in her brother's sacrifice and in her own willingness to protect his memory and his fellow Marines' peace of mind. He turned to face Sarah directly. Martinez, on behalf of this entire unit, I want to thank you for sharing this story with us. Your brother's sacrifice and your dedication to his memory make you exactly the kind of Marine we want fighting alongside us. The circle of Marines began to break up, but instead of dispersing immediately, many of them approached Sarah individually to offer personal apologies and expressions of respect. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of 30 minutes, she had gone from being an object of suspicion to being one of the most respected Marines in the unit. Chun was among the last to approach her. Martinez, I gotta ask, was it worth it? Protecting that secret for so long, Sarah considered the question carefully. Yes, it was worth it, but I'm also glad it's finally over. Carrying that secret alone was harder than I admitted, even to myself. Why now? Maria asked. What changed your mind? The deployment, Sarah replied without hesitation. I realized that going into combat with a unit that didn't trust me completely would be dangerous for everyone. Miguel's sacrifice taught me that sometimes you have to take risks to protect your fellow Marines. This was my version of that. As the crowd finally began to disperse toward breakfast, Stevens lingered behind. Martinez, I need to say something else, he said, his voice serious. I was wrong about you, obviously. But, more than that, I was wrong about what makes someone trustworthy. I thought trust came from knowing everything about a person, but what I learned today is that trust comes from understanding their character and their values. I appreciate that, Sarah replied. And Stevens? You weren't entirely wrong to ask questions. In your position, with deployment coming up, I might have done the same thing. They walked toward the mess hall together, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah felt truly integrated with her unit. The secret she had protected for so long was finally in the open, and rather than destroying her, the revelation had made her stronger. But as she touched her neck where Miguel's Navy Cross was permanently etched into her skin, she knew that this was only the beginning. The real test would come in Afghanistan, where the trust and respect she had earned today would be put to the ultimate test in actual combat. The tattoo that had once been a source of isolation and suspicion was now a symbol of the values that bound her unit together. Miguel's legacy lived on not just in Sarah's memory, but in the understanding and respect of the Marines who would soon depend on each other for their lives. As they entered the mess hall, Sarah realized that she had finally found her place among these Marines. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was a member of a brotherhood forged in shared understanding and mutual respect. And she owed it all to her brother's example and her own courage in finally sharing his story. The burden of secrecy had been lifted, but the responsibility of living up to Miguel's legacy remained. That responsibility felt lighter now that it was shared with Marines who understood its significance and respected its meaning. Together, they would carry that legacy into combat, where the values it represented would be tested in the most demanding crucible of all. 3 months later, the transport plane carrying Sarah's unit descended through the thin mountain air toward Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. The revelation about her tattoo had transformed her relationship with her fellow Marines completely, but now they were about to face the ultimate test of that newly forged trust and respect. Sarah sat in the cramped military transport, surrounded by the Marines who had once viewed her with suspicion and now looked to her as one of their most trusted members. The transformation had been remarkable and swift. Once the truth about Miguel's Navy Cross had been revealed, the unit had embraced her not just as an equal, but as someone whose personal sacrifice and dedication embodied the very best of Marine Corps values. Stephen sat across from her, checking his equipment one final time before landing. The same Marine who had led the charge against her secrecy had become one of her strongest supporters. 3 weeks after her revelation, he had approached her with a request that still surprised her when she thought about it. "Martinez," he had said during a training exercise, "I've been thinking about what you said about your brother's example. I want you to know that if something happens to me over there, I'd be honored if you were the one to write the letter to my family." The request had floored her. In Marine culture, asking someone to write your death letter was one of the highest expressions of trust and respect possible. It meant that Stevens trusted her not just with his life, but with his memory and his family's grief. Similar gestures had come from other Marines in the unit. Walsh had asked her to be his emergency contact. Chin had shared stories about his own family that he had never told anyone else in the military. Maria had become not just a friend, but a sister, someone Sarah knew she could count on no matter what challenges they faced. But perhaps the most significant change had come from Sergeant Rodriguez. 2 days before deployment, he had called Sarah into his office for a private conversation. "Martinez, I want to talk to you about leadership," he had said, gesturing for her to sit down. "Leadership, Sergeant? You've shown this unit something important," Rodriguez explained. "You've shown them what it means to carry a burden quietly, to make sacrifices for others, and to maintain your principles even under pressure. Those are leadership qualities, and I think it's time you started developing them formally." He had handed her paperwork for the Marine Corps' Leadership Development Program, with a recommendation for accelerated promotion to corporal. "I'm recommending you for squad leader training when we return from deployment," Rodriguez had continued. "Your technical skills are excellent, but more importantly, you've earned the respect and trust of your peers in a way that can't be taught." Now, as the plane prepared to land in Afghanistan, Sarah wore corporal's chevrons on her uniform. The promotion had been fast-tracked due to Rodriguez's recommendation and her exemplary performance during pre-deployment training. The plane touched down with a jarring thud, and the Marines began gathering their gear for disembarkation. Afghanistan greeted them with blazing heat and the distinctive smell of dust, fuel, and human activity that characterized military bases and combat zones. As they filed off the plane, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the harsh landscape where Miguel had served and died years earlier. The mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, and the air was thin and dry. This was the place where her brother had made the ultimate sacrifice, and now would test whether she was worthy of carrying his legacy forward. The first few weeks at their forward operating base passed in a blur of acclimatization, briefings, and routine patrols. The unit settled into the rhythm of combat deployment, with Sarah quickly establishing herself as a capable and trusted squad leader. Her calm demeanor under pressure and her genuine concern for her Marines' welfare made her popular with both her peers and her subordinates. But it was during their first significant combat operation that the true impact of Sarah's story became clear. The mission was a routine patrol to a village suspected of harboring Taliban fighters. Intelligence suggested the threat level was moderate, but in Afghanistan, routine missions had a way of becoming anything but routine very quickly. Sarah's squad was providing security for the village search when the ambush began. The first sign of trouble was the distinctive crack of sniper fire, followed immediately by the chatter of automatic weapons from multiple positions around the village. "Contact left," Stevens shouted over the radio, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She assessed the situation quickly, identifying the enemy positions and coordinating her squad's response with practiced efficiency. "Walsh, Chun, move to that building and establish overwatch," she commanded, pointing to a structure that would provide good fields of fire. "Stevens, take your team and flank right. I'll coordinate with the other squads." The firefight that followed was intense, but brief. The Taliban fighters were outnumbered and outgunned, and the Marines' superior training and equipment quickly turned the tide. But as the shooting died down, a new crisis emerged. Private Johnson, a young Marine from another squad, had been hit by sniper fire and was lying exposed in the middle of the village square. The sniper was still active, and anyone who attempted a rescue would be walking into a kill zone. "We need to get to Johnson," the squad leader from the other unit called over the radio. "But that sniper has the whole area covered." Sarah studied the situation carefully. Johnson was wounded, but alive, calling for help from his exposed position. The sniper was positioned in a building approximately 200 meters away, with clear lines of sight to anyone who tried to reach the wounded Marine. In that moment, Sarah thought of Miguel. She thought of the choice he had made to take another Marine's place on a dangerous patrol, knowing the risks, but putting his fellow Marines' welfare above his own safety. "I can get to him," Sarah said into her radio, "but I'll need covering fire and a distraction." "Negative," Rodriguez's voice crackled back. "Too dangerous. We'll call for air support." "Sergeant, Johnson doesn't have time for air support," Sarah replied. "He's losing blood, and that sniper isn't going to wait for us to figure out a safe approach." She looked around at her squad, seeing the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her heart. These Marines trusted her completely, and she trusted them to support whatever decision she made. "Stevens, can you get a clear shot on that building with the grenade launcher?" she asked. "Affirmative. But, Martinez, you'll still be exposed for at least 30 seconds while you reach Johnson." Sarah touched her neck, where Miguel's Navy Cross was tattooed on her skin. Her brother had faced a similar choice in Fallujah: risk his own life to save a fellow Marine, or play it safe and hope for a better opportunity that might never come. 30 seconds is all I need," she said. "On my mark, I want maximum suppressive fire on that building. Stevens, put 3 rounds through that window where the sniper is positioned. Walsh, Chun, I need you to lay down covering fire across the entire area." She took a deep breath and prepared to move. "Remember, as soon as I reach Johnson, be ready to provide cover for our withdrawal." "Martinez," Rodriguez's voice came over the radio again. "This is a direct order. Do not attempt that rescue." Sarah paused, the weight of disobedience heavy on her conscience. But she looked at Johnson, bleeding in the dirt and calling for his mother, and she knew what Miguel would have done. "Sergeant, with all due respect, sometimes Marines have to make their own decisions about what's right," she said. "I'm going to get our Marine." She switched to her squad frequency. "All units, execute covering fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The air erupted with gunfire as Sarah's squad and the other Marines opened up on the sniper's position. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, her heart pounding but her mind crystal clear. This was what she had trained for, what Miguel's example had prepared her for. The sniper's rifle cracked twice during her run, both bullets missing by inches. Sarah reached Johnson and quickly assessed his wounds, a bullet through the shoulder and possible internal injuries from the impact. "Hold on, Johnson," she said, applying pressure to the wound while scanning for the best route back to cover. "I'm getting you out of here. I can't move my arm." Johnson gasped, his face pale with shock and blood loss. "You don't need to move anything," Sarah replied, hefting the larger Marine into a fireman's carry. "Just hold on tight, and let me do the work." The journey back to cover was the longest 30 seconds of Sarah's life. Bullets whined past them as the sniper tried desperately to score a hit, but the covering fire from her squad was relentless and accurate. Stevens' grenade rounds had forced the sniper to change positions, disrupting his aim at the crucial moment. Sarah reached cover with Johnson still alive, immediately turning him over to the unit's medic for treatment. Only then did she realize that she had been hit. A bullet had grazed her left arm during the rescue, leaving a bleeding furrow in her bicep. "Martinez," Stevens called out, pointing at her wounded arm. "You're hit." She looked down at the wound with surprise. In the adrenaline of the rescue, she hadn't even felt it. It's just a scratch. How's Johnson? The medic looked up from his patient. He'll be fine. You got to him just in time. Another few minutes, and he would have bled out. As the unit established security and called for evacuation, Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression that mixed anger with grudging respect. Corporal Martinez, you directly disobeyed my order, he said sternly. Yes, Sergeant, I did, Sarah replied without apology. And I'd do it again. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, then glanced over at Johnson, who was being prepared for medical evacuation. Your brother will be proud, he said finally. But don't make a habit of disobeying orders. Only when it's the right thing to do, Sergeant. That evening, as the unit settled in after the successful mission, Stevens approached Sarah as she sat cleaning her rifle. You know what you did today? He said, sitting down beside her. I rescued a wounded Marine, Sarah replied simply. No, you did more than that, Stevens continued. You showed us what your brother's legacy really means. That tattoo isn't just a memorial. It's a guide for how to live and serve with honor. Over the following months, Sarah's reputation grew throughout the base. The story of her rescue of Johnson spread quickly, but what impressed people even more was her consistent dedication to her Marines' welfare and her willingness to put herself at risk for others. She led dozens of patrols, participated in major operations against Taliban strongholds, and consistently demonstrated the kind of leadership and courage that earned respect from both her subordinates and her superiors. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during a quiet evening 6 months into their deployment. The unit was at a remote outpost, pulling security duty during a period of relative calm. Sarah was sitting outside her bunker, writing a letter home, when Rodriguez approached with a young Marine she hadn't met before. Martinez, this is Private Foster, Rodriguez said. He's new to the unit, just arrived yesterday. Sarah looked up at the young Marine, seeing her own nervousness and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. Foster here has some questions about that tattoo on your neck, Rodriguez continued with a slight smile. Seems he's heard stories and wants to know if they're true. Sarah looked at Foster, then at the small group of Marines who had gathered around, drawn by the mention of her tattoo. She realized that her story had become part of the unit's culture, passed down to new arrivals, as an example of what the Marine Corps stood for. What would you like to know, Foster? She asked kindly. Is it true that you got that tattoo to honor your brother? The young Marine asked hesitantly. Yes, it is, Sarah replied. My brother Miguel earned the Navy Cross, serving with the Marines in Iraq. He died saving his fellow Marines. And is it true that you rescued Private Johnson under fire because of your brother's example? Sarah considered the question carefully. I rescued Johnson because he was a Marine in trouble, and Marines take care of each other. My brother's example helped me understand what that really means, but the decision was mine. She stood up and faced the group of young Marines who were listening intently. The tattoo reminds me every day that we serve something bigger than ourselves, she continued. It reminds me that honor isn't just a word we use in our motto. It's a way of living and serving that requires sacrifice and courage. Foster nodded solemnly, clearly moved by her words. My brother Miguel never got to come home from his deployment, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. But his example came home with me, and now it's part of all of us. Every time we choose to do the hard thing, the right thing, even when it costs us something, we honor his memory and the memory of every Marine who came before us. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Sarah returned to her letter home. She wrote about the deployment, about her Marines, about the challenges and triumphs they had shared. But mostly, she wrote about Miguel and how his legacy continued to guide her every day. The tattoo on her neck was no longer a secret to be hidden or a source of suspicion and doubt. It had become a symbol of the values that bound her unit together, a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made for their freedom and the responsibilities that came with wearing the Marine uniform. When their deployment ended and the unit returned to Camp Pendleton, Sarah was recommended for promotion to sergeant and assignment as a platoon sergeant. The young woman who had once been ridiculed for her mysterious tattoo had become a leader that other Marines looked up to and wanted to follow. At the homecoming ceremony, Sarah stood with her unit as families and friends welcomed them back from deployment. As she scanned the crowd, she saw Miguel's face in her memory, smiling with pride at what she had become. The tattoo on her neck, while